All right, guys, today we're going to talk about biological theories. So, generally speaking, we don't use any sort of abnormal biology or abnormal physiology to describe criminal behavior, at least not directly. Traditional biological theories focused on genetic abnormalities, physical abnormalities, and didn't really look at the effect of the social environment. Modern biological theories focus on biological variations and how those biological predispositions or biological differences interact with social and psychological variables. So let's start with a review of some early theories. And we touched upon Lombroso the other day. So we know that the classical school of thought is sort of the early school of thought that describes criminal behavior, right? And if you recall, classical school of thought says essentially crime is a free will decision, that people behave rationally, they sort of weigh the pros and cons, what are the benefits they might get from engaging in this behavior compared to the consequences, and that they act in ways that will maximize their benefits and minimize any consequences. This school of thought dominates until the later part of the 19th century. And then here we start to see biological positivism. So positivism is sort of the opposite school of thought of classical school of thought. It has many, many more theories underneath it. Positivism refers to things that would explain criminal behavior other than free will. It also really advocates for an empirical study of crime. And while you'll see that early empirical studies are not really good studies, they are still trying to scientifically explain criminal behavior. Crime is not a rationally reasoned behavior that can be prevented through just the threat of punishment. These early biological schools of thought say that crime is a result of inborn abnormalities, that our physiological traits reflect our mental and psychological makeup, and that causes us to break the law. So essentially, any biological differences we see might be indicative of psychological and mental issues. Then what happens is we might have these predispositions or these biological issues, and the environment could either restrain our criminal behavior, stop that from happening, or provoke it. So while they do not cause crime, they sort of create the conditions that would allow that to surface. So a real criminal is born with criminal traits. And early on, what we're looking at here is theories that are based in Darwinism, right? So if you recall, Darwin talks about evolution, and they're basically arguing here that people who break the law are biologically inferior. Essentially, Lombroso refers to them as atavistic throwbacks. Atavistic means ape-like. So essentially, part of why they break the law, or the reason they break the law, because they aren't properly evolved. So if biology is driving our criminal behavior, then the threat of punishment won't really do anything to stop that. So society can still punish offenders, but we do so for our own protection. This means, though, that how certain a punishment is or how severe it is isn't really going to impact an offender's decision to break the law. So Lombroso talks about the criminal man, right? He writes this essay. And as I mentioned, he says a born criminal is an atavism, okay? So that's a throwback to an earlier stage of development. And as I mentioned, atavistic means ape-like. They're essentially unsuited for life in civilized society and will, without a doubt, violate the rules of society. Remember, Lombroso is studying in Italy, and he is comparing prisoners to soldiers. So one thing that we want to think about is if we're using, for our population of study, people that are known offenders, this isn't really a good way of studying behavior. These are known offenders, and it's going to skew our data. He talks about the way that we know someone is an atavistic throwback, right, or a born criminal, is that they have to possess at least 5 physical stigmata. Okay, these include monkey-like ears, large lips, supernumerary, which means more than they normally are in number. Fingers, toes, supernumerary nipples is also on this list. They have that beak-like nose. We know that they have the long arm span. 5 or more stigmata make you a born criminal. Females, however, could be identified with as few as 3 stigmata. And these were measurements that were used to identify criminals before we had fingerprinting. So if you think about today, we have fingerprinting, we have retina scans, we have DNA as a way of identifying someone, but also we still do use some physical identification. So if you think about what someone's booking sheet looks like, it's going to include things like height and weight and hair color and eye color, known scars, tattoos. So Lombroso co-writes a book about female offenders, and he authors this with his son-in-law. And they said, why are there more male than female born criminals? And they argue, again, looking at Darwinism, that this is a process of natural selection. Men are less likely to breed with physically deformed women. So those degenerative traits in women are unlikely to be passed on. He talks about 2 other types of criminals. So we've got that born offender, that true criminal. We've got an insane criminal. This is somebody who is an imbecile, might be epileptic, might be psychotic, and they're not capable of controlling their behavior. They don't possess criminal stigmata, but they are still unsafe for society. Criminaloid is motivated by passion or has an emotional makeup that compels them under the right circumstances. One of the next things we see under biological theories is from Charles Goring in 1937, and he writes about English convicts, and he reports about years of his research. He uses physical measurements and statistical techniques, and he compares, again, inmates with undergrad, soldiers, professors, and hospital patients. He looks at 37 different traits and finds that there are no statistically significant differences between the prison inmates and these other groups of people, presumed to not be offenders. Remember, we're not just looking for, is there a difference that we see, right, that we could count or measure, but we need to know, is that due to chance or is it due to a real difference, right? So statistical significance tells us that that the difference is not due to chance. So Goring concludes that Lombroso is wrong. And this comes to be seen as sort of the definitive piece of research that refutes Lombroso and proves him wrong. And so even though these early theories we know to be wrong today, they're still important to study because theory builds upon prior research. He did find some statistically significant differences for their body stature and weight. Prisoners were shorter and thinner, and just by his impression, not by any statistical measure, he thought they were of lower intelligence. He took these findings as evidence then that criminals had a defective physique and intelligence. But what he's not looking at here is how does the prison environment perhaps impact those things. And again, he's not measuring intelligence objectively. In 1933, Hooton writes Crime and the Man, and he's an anthropologist. He attacked Goring's conclusions and his methods, and he conducted a study of 17,000 individuals. He took meticulous measurements of their physical characteristics, and he did this of people in prisons, reformatories, and county jails. He then compared them to college students, hospital patients, firemen, and policemen. So let's start with some extra credit, okay? And this will be due on the 24th by 11 a.m. by email. Just a reminder that, with the exception of this question, generally speaking, I want the answer and I want you to include a link to a credible source. So what do you think is one of the flaws, what do you think is one of the reasons that these early researchers are using college students, hospital patients, firemen, policemen, soldiers, right? Why these groups of people as their comparison groups? What is it about those groups? Hooton concludes then that criminals are basically organically inferior. His work is also criticized, and this happens with every person who puts out some work. His differences were actually quite small. So you'll remember in the previous online lecture, we talked about we're not just looking for something to be statistically significant. We also want to look at what we call the effect size. So how big of an impact does that difference have? And if the differences are very small, so if I told you that you had a 1% better chance of winning the lottery than I did, would you necessarily feel like you have to rush out and buy a lottery ticket? Hopefully not, because that's not really a big difference. Also think about this. He included firemen and policemen as control subjects or as his comparison group. Firemen and policemen have something in common. There's part of their selection for their job is based on their physical qualities, right? So they have to be able to meet physical fitness tests. They have to be able to carry up certain weights. And so we should see some differences between them and the general population as a whole. There was more variation amongst the prisoners themselves, so there was more in-group variation there than there really was between group variation between the prisoners and the civilians. He also only looked at their most recent offense, and differences were always interpreted as deficiencies. They weren't necessarily ever interpreted as beneficial qualities. So he ignored any similarities. Also, we want to remember, too, that his reasoning is circular. It's tautological. There's no way to falsify this work. So these theories are reflected in theories then that talk about how offenders inherit their criminal traits, that they're feeble-minded, that it's the result of their body type. These early works, they're not really looking at social or environmental factors. So what are some inadequacies of these early theories? They don't pay attention to social, economic, and environmental factors. There's flaws in the methodology. There's quite a bit of circular reasoning. And what research was done on them doesn't really support the theory. So by the 1950s, we thoroughly discredited these theories. It also resulted in some really controversial, I guess what we would call policy implications. So if what's wrong with you, or if what causes someone to be an offender is their biology, how do we address that? So for your second extra credit question, what would be policy implications? So I want you to send me at least one policy implication based on early biological theories. So as I mentioned, I think before, more modern theories look at or tend to be biosocial in nature, so they're combining biology and social factors. One place where we're still sort of going wrong here is a lot of this research is conducted either by a medical person who understands hormones and neurotransmitters, or a criminologist. I think the flaw here with this research is that you would really want someone who understands both pieces, both the medical and biological issues as well as the social issues, in order to really formulate a proper test of these theories. And most people are not trained in both. As you can imagine, most people with medical training are probably not looking to go back and study criminology. Modern theories based on newer discoveries. So obviously we have immense medical advancements. We know more about genetics. We've been able to map some human genetics. We know more about how the brain functions. So some newer theories look at things like biochemistry, hormones, metabolism, nutrition. It does look at genetics, and it also looks at neurophysiology. That's your brain, your central nervous system, your physiological arousal levels, neurotransmitters. And some of these theories and some of these writings can be kind of hard to follow because most of us don't know a whole lot about neurotransmitters or the central nervous system. So we tend to look at the interaction of biological makeup and physical and social nature. So basically, as opposed to sort of this nature versus nurture argument, we're looking at nature via nurture, right? How do nature and nurture work together? So perhaps you have a hormone imbalance or some physiological traits that could make you prone to offending. How does your social environment either enhance that or keep that from coming out? The biological factors may interact with and be affected by the physical and social environment, and your physical and social environment may in turn impact your biology. So let's start by looking at IQ, mental functioning, and delinquency. So research has consistently found a weak to moderate negative correlation between IQ and delinquency. Remember, correlation means that the two things seem to change together, but it doesn't necessarily mean one thing causes another. Negative means they go in opposite directions. So this would mean the higher one's IQ, the less likely they are to be involved with delinquency. And they still find this even when they control for things like class, race, and other factors that would be relevant. So Travis Hershey, who's a really well-known researcher and theorist, and Hindelang showed this relationship to be at least as strong as the one between delinquency and social class. Social class is also a fairly weak predictor. Herrnstein and Murray looked at people with low IQ and found that they have a cognitive disadvantage. One of the things that they argue then is our IQ is probably about 80% inheritable, right? So we can only slightly modify our IQ. So its impact then is highly resistant to any other factors: nutrition, education, family. Cullen found that IQ explains a very low percentage of variance when they talk to people about their self-reported crimes. So it explained about 1.5% of the difference in offending, and a modest amount among people in jail, 9.6%. They also added other factors that have been previously ignored. So does a person live in an urban area? What's their religious participation? Are they living with their father? When we add those factors in, the effect on incarceration is even weaker. So IQ becomes even weaker. These other factors are much more important. And then the relationship between IQ and self-reported delinquency disappears. And this is why, if you recall from research methods or statistics, it's really important to make sure we try to include as many variables as might possibly be playing a role here. If we only include IQ and offending, we might find that there is a relationship there, but that could be because some other factor is actually impacting IQ or is associated with IQ and is impacting delinquency and offending. So Hershey and Hindelang tell us then that the relationship between IQ and delinquency is indirect. IQ is not directly impacting delinquency, okay? So low IQ means our school performance and the way we handle school and the way we adjust to school is not going to be as good. This, in turn, increases the probability of delinquency. So what Gordon thinks then is that IQ is really tapping into an underlying factor, okay, which then relates to delinquent behavior. Racial differences in intelligence are highly controversial and unsettled. So a lot of times IQ effects are rejected because measures of standardized testing have been shown to show some racial bias. But the effect is still difficult to dismiss because it doesn't completely disappear even when we control for other variables. When they look at longitudinal studies, so they look at something over a period of time, we find it doesn't hold up. Also, the earlier the IQ is measured, the earlier age it's measured, it's not as good at predicting future delinquency. So, if this were true, and it held consistent over time, the effects of IQ, what theories would that support? Often people conclude that it supports biological theories, right? It assumes that IQ is biological and therefore is having a direct impact on offending. But as we know, if IQ is mutable, if it's possible to change your IQ, then it would at least partly be attributed to socialization and education, in which case now IQ is having an indirect impact. Therefore, it would be reflective of non-biological theories. This is one of the reasons it's really important to figure out, is the operating factor IQ or is it something else? And making sure we really understand how we're measuring IQ and what IQ is reflective of. Moffitt, Lyman, and Silver looked at neuropsychological models of male delinquency, and they incorporated some other aspects of mental functioning. People's verbal ability, their mental flexibility, and they found predictors of early onset life course persistent offending, okay? So remember, Moffitt talked about two types of offenders, right? So there's early onset, or what we call life course persistent offenders. They start offending at an earlier age. They engage in more serious offending, and they tend to continue into adulthood. So these are what we generally think of as chronic offenders. There's also adolescent limited offenders, and these are people who their offending starts a little later, and it's linked to biological and social changes during adolescence, and they tend to age out. So these mental functioning aspects were related to chronic offending. Tibbetts and Piquero. Alex Piquero is also a really well-known researcher. He's at a University of Texas, Dallas, UT Dallas, and he has written extensively and has done some really interesting research. They have found some supporting evidence. Children that are raised in disadvantaged environments, that for those children, low birth weight is a modest predictor of early onset delinquency for men. But let's think about that. How is someone likely to end up with a low birth weight? Right? So that's the weight at which they're born. Basically saying that it's lower than what is pretty typical at that, at birth. Those are probably more disadvantaged people. They haven't been able to see as much prenatal care. Perhaps their nutrition isn't as good. And so perhaps what's happening then is the things that contribute to low birth weight also contribute to early delinquency. What about testosterone? Testosterone could be a great explainer, a great variable that would help explain why men offend at such a high rate compared to women. So people have looked at testosterone levels and how that impacts aggressive behavior. There is a connection between testosterone levels and sexual behavior, substance use, smoking, and nonviolent crime. However, this is a weak, statistically significant relationship, and this may be due to other social factors and their impact on testosterone. So you guys might recall from criminology learning about the subculture of violence. This is really prevalent in the southern part of the United States. These are communities where violence is considered a problem-solving tool, and not only is it acceptable, but it's almost demanded. So it's almost unacceptable for you to not respond violently. So testosterone doesn't cause aggressive behavior, but it certainly can help facilitate it. Booth and Osgood, when they looked at testosterone, they also controlled for age and race. They did find a relationship between testosterone and adult offending, but as soon as they introduced other measures like how well socially integrated someone was and measures of prior delinquency, that reduced that relationship. So this is something we always want to look at when we're looking at our research. We might find something promising, but we really have to see if something else at play. So the evidence was enough to be of interest, but it's really not a major determinant of criminal offending. What about behavioral genetics? Rowe categorized our heritable factors as behavioral genetics, which is the interplay of our genetic makeup and our environment, and evolutionary psychology, which focus more on universal behaviors or behaviors specific to men or to women. They hypothesized that genetic factors act through our prefrontal cortex. So if you recall, I mentioned before the prefrontal cortex that's in the front part of our brain. It's responsible, one of the things it's responsible for is rational decision making. And it's not fully developed probably till our early to mid 20s. So essentially our genetics could impact how our prefrontal cortex operates. It could contribute to things like a low attention span, low self-control, people who are constantly sensation seeking. These are things, if you think about them from a common sense perspective, it's kind of easy to see how this could increase criminal behavior. If you're low in self-control and you have a low attention span and you're always sort of, looking for something that's going on, you can see how easily this could lead to you getting into physical altercations with people. Whether or not, however, these genetic factors exist, right? So we all know some people with low self-control that probably make really bad decisions and some who don't, okay? That really depends on our environments, both our shared and our non-shared environments. What's our social class? Who are our parents? How are they raising us? What role does religion play in our life? As well as differences among families, siblings, peer groups, and teachers. So what happens is these biological factors could affect how we act and create those environments. Okay, so you might be low in self-control, but your parents might have really worked on this behavior with you, and so you might be better at controlling it. Harris said the main effect of family on this behavior comes from genetic transmission of our temperament and predispositions, not necessarily the learning environment of the family. And he says that the social environments that are most important are our peer groups, and those are outside of our family. Wright and Beaver looked at differences in parenting and argued that they have little impact on ADHD. Once we control for genetic similarities in families, parental socialization doesn't really play a role here. ADHD is seen as being a predictor of low self-control. He's saying the big argument about low self-control theory is that low self-control comes from poor parenting, but Wright and Beaver is saying it actually comes from the executive control function areas of the brain. Mendick talks about biosocial theories and proposes that some genetic factors related to crime may be passed along from parent to offspring. And so they're not directly inherited and they're not a direct cause of behavior, but they might make us more prone to certain behaviors or more prone to fall prey to a criminological environment. So think about, you could inherit from someone in your family a predisposition to drug addiction or alcohol abuse. But if you never overdrink, and you don't use drugs, that would not necessarily develop. So perhaps people are inheriting a nervous system that's slower to be aroused or to react to stimuli. This might make it more difficult to learn to control aggressive or antisocial behavior, and therefore you might be at greater risk to become lawbreakers. Eisenek looked at people with low arousability and found they're less likely to learn pro-social behavior. Whereas Ellis says some are more prone to crime because they have general tendencies to engage in risky behavior, thrill-seeking, or impulsive behavior. So some people are risk takers, thrill seekers, right? Adrenaline junkies, and they just might channel that in really positive ways. Maybe these are the guys who go bungee cord jumping, or they're into race car driving. And some people channel that into criminal behavior. What basically is happening, and this is sort of a misunderstanding about ADD and ADHD. Some people tend to think that people with ADD or ADHD are extra stimulated, right? And they sort of appear that way. But actually, they have suboptimal levels of arousal. And so the reason they're so hyper on focus is that they're trying to get enough, they're trying to compensate for that. However, these theories don't explain why people adapt to low arousability with crime as opposed to legal behavior. So none of these theories are sort of explaining the difference between the guy who goes skydiving and engages in thrill-seeking legal behavior and the guy who doesn't. Ellis tried to look at relationships between our religiosity, how religious we are in delinquency. He argued that people with a low arousability find church boring, and they might gravitate towards delinquency because it is exciting. This seems like a bit of a stretch to me personally. Mendick did a study in Copenhagen, and they linked the criminality of biological fathers with criminal behavior of sons who've been adopted. So one of the ways we try to study biology is to look at either twins, and especially identical twins who have the same genetic makeup and the same DNA, and to also look at children who have been adopted, so we can compare sort of the biology of the biological family and the environment in which the child was actually raised with their adoptive family. The highest rates of officially recorded criminal offenses were among sons whose biological and adopted dads had criminal records. And that sort of makes sense, right? Because here we've got, if there is a biological predisposition, you've got your social environment enacting on it. So maybe you inherit a predisposition from your biological dad for criminal behavior, and then if your adoptive father is not really modeling pro-social behavior for you, that might allow that to come through. The lowest rates are when neither father has a criminal record. So what happens to people whose biological dads have records but their adopted dads did not? They were more likely to be criminals than those whose adopted dad but not biological dads had a criminal record. Cochrane, Wood, and Arnaclove look at sensation-seeking tendencies. They're modestly related to alcohol use. They're not related to marijuana use. They don't mediate the effects of religion or gender on substance use, and they have a similar indirect measures of, or they're looking at similar indirect measures of arousal as well. Then they redid the study on a larger scale. They did it all over Denmark. They interpreted the findings as a replication of his findings, and they're amongst the most frequently cited in support of heritability. So there's quite a bit of research that comes out of Denmark and the Netherlands. Gopperson and Hershey point to some serious flaws. They said, well, Swedish and American adoption research has been found to have very small, insignificant differences. So they're not statistically significant. They could be due to chance, and the impact is very minor. As I mentioned, we also look at twin studies, and the central concept here is concordance. We're looking for a quantitative measurement of the degree to which the observed behavior of one twin or one sibling matches the other. And so most studies find higher concordance between criminal and non-criminal behavior of identical twins than fraternal twins. So recall that identical twins are one fertilized egg that splits in two early on, and so they have the exact same DNA and genetic makeup. Fraternal twins are two eggs that get fertilized at the same time, and so they're no more similar or different than any other two siblings. However, we want to just remember that sometimes people treat twins very similarly. So I have brothers that are fraternal twins. They could not be more different, and they don't even look like they're related at all. But we always sort of, when they were younger, referred to them as the boys, okay? And they did a lot of the same activities together. And so they were reared very similarly. And so the same thing could also happen with identical twins as well. And so how much of this is due to genetics versus the environment in which you're raised? Twin studies measure biological and social variables indirectly, okay? So the more indirect our measurement, again, we don't know if we're really tapping the variable all that well or all that accurately. So biological measures are looking at the degree of behavioral similarities between biological parents and offspring when the bio parents don't raise a child. And as far as the social things, we're looking at similarities in behavior of adopted parents and adoptees. So the concordance of twins reared apart is attributed to biological factors because, and here's the other thing, we just assume their social environments are different. They might not be that different. We also assume that children reared together have similar social environments, and that's not always true either. So for those of you that have brothers or sisters, you might, if you think about this, you were probably treated differently in some ways than your siblings were. You weren't necessarily raised the exact same way. Also, you want to remember if there's a large age difference, that plays a role too. So I'm the oldest of 5, but there's at least 5 to 6 years between me and my sister, and then another 5 years between my sister and my twin brothers, and then there's another 10 years between them and my baby brother. So my youngest brother was raised very differently than I was. Assumptions in these studies hold only partially for social variables in the family. We don't know how the other social environments differ. The findings fit other theories as well as or better than genetic interpretation. So some people talk about how it points to sort of the contagious nature of antisocial behavior. So what we're talking about here is the risk to a given individual increases when someone close to them is also engaging in this behavior. So I used to think that I was just one of those kids who made really good decisions about drugs and alcohol when I was a teenager. But I also didn't have friends that were doing drugs. And so was I some awesome person who managed to just resist peer pressure like a champ? Or did I just not have the opportunity? So is that more reflective of the friends I have? So sometimes antisocial behavior is explained by contagion. We tend to behave similarly and engage in similar behaviors as the people we spend a lot of time with. Right? Think about especially your teen years, your friends become really important to you, and you guys tend to behave in similar ways. So genetic explanations are least explicable for adolescent delinquency. Rowe found that individual differences in self-reported delinquency are more the result of genetic factors than common or specific environmental factors. When we adjust, though, for the influence of our siblings, that effect is reduced. It's reduced by about half. So delinquency is best explained by the combined effects of our genetics our heredity, and our family environment. What about genetically transmitted criminal susceptibility, right? So we're talking here about evolutionary theory. Ellis and Walsh talk about gene-based evolutionary theory, and they say that this can explain criminal behavior in general and in specific types of crimes. And this is the article that we're going to talk about in class, so I'm going to skip over most of it. But they're basically saying the decision to commit rape, or the disposition, someone's disposition to commit rape, is a result of, because it's a reproductive advantage. So we'll talk about that in class. So how empirically valid are these theories? Even these modern theories that attempt to account for the interplay between nature and nurture. Modern research has yet to establish any empirical validity for these theories. There continues to be problems with the research. So the way we're measuring crime, sample sizes, any bias in how we're sampling people. And then most importantly, with any type of research, we would like for our findings to be generalizable to the larger population. And that has not held true so far. The more they incorporate environment into the theories, the more explanatory they are. But also, the more they start to look like environmental theories, right? So they start to look less like biological theories. So what would some policy implications of these theories be? Well, if biological causes are immutable, so I can't change your genetics, then we start to get into some really invasive and restrictive interventions. If our biology is our destiny and crime is innate, then offenders can't be deterred by punishment. They can't be rehabilitated. And I'm going to skip over the slides because that's your extra credit question. Extra credit question number 2. And that one as well. And that one as well. More contemporary approaches look at things like your diet and how your diet might be impacting any biological predisposition. Drug therapies. Taking public health approaches to overcoming those biological risks. Again, these policy interventions start to look like policy interventions though for other theories, and so they start to look less and less like biological theories. And that wraps it up. So remember, you have 2 potential extra credit questions. That means as of now, there are 5 points you could have earned towards your first exam. And so I will see you guys in class.